All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks so much for the organizers of BSides Belfast for inviting me. It's a wonderful event, and it's an honor to be here speaking to all of you. Can you all in the back hear me all the way back there? We're good? Perfect. Okay. And I landed from Virginia yesterday at like 4. So if I just stare off into the distance, just get out some smelling salts or snap your finger, and hopefully I'll come back to it. On a lot of caffeine right now. We have a lot of material to go through. There are going to be some things that I go a little faster through. All of these slides, which are kind of meant as a guide, will be available on a GitHub, and I'll find somewhere to share it with all of you, so that you can bring it up and use notes if you have the misfortune of needing to recover your domain. So a little bit about myself. Me and my coworker, who unfortunately could not make it, Josh Prager, are the researchers who came up with the contents of this talk here. My name's Nico Shine, like was mentioned, originally from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, currently live in Virginia. Went to and got my degree in cyber operations from the U.S. Naval Academy. Did 5 years in the Navy as an information professional officer, primarily working with satellites, cryptography, RF. So not at all what I'm about to talk about today. But it's been a fun process conducting this research and learning about all this. Also love movies, live music, so any recommendations here to the Belfast area, which is a city I've always wanted to visit, I'll gladly take those. All right, so purpose of this presentation. When I talk about domain recovery, inevitably there will probably be someone in the back yelling, just rotate the KRBTGT twice, right? Because that's the main guidance that we're aware of when it comes to what do we need to do to ensure that the adversary is kicked out of our domain. So the purpose of this conversation, and I'll bring this back to a client story, is we had a client that brought in SpectropOps to do some forensics and said, okay, we think we have adversary activity in our domain going back 2 years. We think we've gotten all of it. We think we've cleaned everything up, and we're fully recovered. Before we bring this to our board, we'd like you to come and certify that. So we came in, and honestly, it seemed like someone who was surprised they got entrance. It was a lot of shoddy tradecraft, literally, like malware _ shell type stuff just all over some of the shared drives that they had. And we found adversary activity going back 4 years, not the 2 years like they initially thought. Now, when we're talking about domain recovery and why that might be an issue, there probably aren't a lot of people here that could afford to just entirely take a domain offline and rebuild a new one with no cost to operations, right? A lot of the time where we see incomplete or shoddy domain recovery, it's because leadership has a business problem they're trying to solve, right? We can't take a week off to completely rebuild everything because that's losing us money. So what we want to do here today is say, okay, so what can we do in an actual enterprise environment to make sure that that domain is recovered and that we root out all of that adversary activity? And what we found, because we conducted interviews with a bunch of our clients to try to come up with some sort of baseline for this research, is that a lot of organizations didn't really have playbooks, didn't really have audit guidance, didn't really have any standardization to say, okay, adversary evicted from domain, we can certify this domain is good to go. So when we're talking about domain persistence, we're going to talk about a bunch of different techniques first, right? And these techniques could be credential theft methods, they could be authentication functionality abuses, they could be endpoint management abuses, and these techniques have a few different common denominators. So evidence of domain persistence is evidence of a larger attack path, right? A lot of these will require domain admin in order to carry out the attack. If someone got domain admin in your domain, you probably have some other attack surfaces or some other attack chains that are going to cause an issue for you, right? So it's never just, okay, we saw DCSync. Well, it would be lovely for red teams if you could just DCSync from the get-go, but that's not the case, right? You have to build part of a chain, part of a larger attack path. Techniques represent, right, that tier 0 access that the adversary is able to get. So we're going to talk about a few different high-level techniques that we often see when we're talking about adversary domain persistence. And you can see, again, I won't go through all these just in the interest of time, but these are the discussion points for today. And some of the techniques we're going to touch on before we move into triage and recovery and auditing and kind of the defensive side of it are going to be credential theft and NTDS.did access, DCSync, golden and diamond tickets, ADCS certificate theft, and SSCM site takeover, right? And for each of these, we're going to do a brief overview because this talk is kind of meant to start in a general place and go into the technical and specific. So it'll start out basic, but we'll move into specific detection guidelines for each of these techniques, and then ultimately how we triage. All right. So when we're talking about credential theft, right, which is just as easy as right-clicking on lsas.exe on Task Manager, creating a dump file, and then parsing through those, there's going to be a few different differences we care about when something is opening a handle to an LSAS process. Some methods are going to try to change the Mimikatz flag rights, right? If you see Mimikatz with 1410 or 1010 access flag, I know in a lot of our client environments, that's one of the first detections we set up. So if you're lazy and don't change those access flags or try to just use Mimikatz default, that will get caught right out of the box. And some methods are going to avoid that open process of lsas.exe, and they're going to instead look for leaked handles. They're going to try to create child processes of LSAS, or they're going to try to create a snapshot. And you see here the typical operational flow for that credential theft. Okay, so what's the difference between a host and credential theft on a domain controller? Well, when we're talking about different defensive measures we can take, on the host you can enable CredGuard, right, which isolates that lsas.exe process. Microsoft, in its documentation, strongly discourages you from enabling CredGuard on your domain controller, because if you isolate LSAS on your domain controller, you're going to come up with all sorts of issues when it comes with syncing or getting credentials across your domain. So again, that's going to be the main difference, that the domain controller actually is slightly more vulnerable just because those preventative controls are not enabled. And additionally, you usually have interactive logons with those tier 0 admin accounts. All right, so this is a brief breakdown of how we at SpectreOps usually try to build detections, right? This is usually the course of a few different weeks of research and study. Really what you ultimately need to see is we have something we care about, like process creation. We have an entity relationship, right? A process creating a process. And then we link that to either sysmon, Windows security event, IDs, whatever you care about. And those are things that we can link to, right? Because for us, for example, right, we do a lot of our infrastructure is automated. So whenever we do a red team, there's never going to be the same IOC. There's never going to be the same hash. It's not going to be mimikatz.exe, right? So if you have detections just for those kind of baseline configurations, you're not really getting at the underlying behavior, which is what we're trying to do with these detections. So instead of just saying, okay, we're going to monitor for that one specific tool, here are a variety of event IDs tied to different behaviors that are all linked to that MITRE technique. And again, this will all be available on GitHub, and I know we're in a little bit of a hurry, but we will, I'm happy to talk with people afterwards as well as how we arrived at some of these. All right, so another option, right, is to create a shadow copy of the DC itself using volume shadow service to try to get that ntds.dip file. That ntds.dip file is normally hard locked while ADCS is using it, and in most domains, ADCS is always using it because ADCS is on by definition. So that copy is going to let you access data like the domain DPAPI backup key, right? And we'll get into why that's important later. So manipulation of that ntds.dip file generates some form of telemetry. What you can do is set a SACL on that ntds.dip file, and you can see the settings required for that SACL there. So if anyone tries to modify the dip file, you're going to get alerts generated from the SACL you set on it. And again, this is not default. So if you haven't gone in and set that SACL on the ntds.dip file, you're not going to generate telemetry if people try to interact with it. You can also look at if the volume shadow service is started and begins reading, you'll generate telemetry, and that could potentially lead to alerts that lead to behavior. For example, if VSS is running at like 2 a.m., probably suspicious, worth looking into. And again, we have the same breakdown here, right? With the behavior we're looking at, the entity relationship linked to that behavior, for example, process requested handle to a file, and then the Windows security event IDs and the sysmon event IDs. And you can build these out with whatever tool you use, Carbon Black, CrowdStrike, whatever, and link those to the underlying behavior. All right, so DCSync is one we're probably all very familiar with. It's well known, lots of detections, blog posts, event IDs linked to it from Splunk Lantern, Palo Alto Unit 42, etc. And it rose in popularity due to kind of the ethics with red teams messing with ntds.dip, because that ntds.dip file, again, has that domain DPAPI backup key. And so what red teams were finding is, okay, we now have the one key that cannot be changed in your domain that can decrypt all of the information in your domain. So due to ethics reasons, a lot of red teams move to DCSync, and it's more popular in that space. And again, we just have here some of the detections linked to the underlying behavior. All right, so with golden tickets, show of hands, who's familiar with like the way the KDC, TGT, all that interacts when we're talking about Kerberos? Okay, so probably good to do a baseline then. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay, so KRBTGT account, Microsoft Active Directory. It's a service account. It's going to act as the Key Distribution Center, or KDC. You'll hear me mention that a few different times. It's going to be central to the function of that Kerberos protocol within AD, which is used for network authentication. And that's, at that high level, that's really what we need to know. But that KRBTGT account's primary role is creating TGTs, or ticket granting tickets. So imagine how annoying it would be, right, if you have a file share in your enterprise and every time you want to open something on the SharePoint, you had to like put in a password, right? It'd be very irritating if you had to go to your company services, Tuesday's meeting and put in a password every time you opened up Tuesday's meeting notes. Kerberos handles that by doing all the authentication behind the scenes, which is where the Pokemon flavored attacks of like Golden, Diamond, the latest one is Sapphire Ticket. I assume the next one will be Ruby Red or something like that. But the typical operational flow we'll see with that, right? Adversary needs that FQDN, the formal domain name, the SID of the domain. As of 2021, you also need the account you're trying to impersonate. That's something Microsoft implemented. Before, you could just kind of blindly create a golden ticket, which is a way of, again, interacting with all those services without needing to authenticate correctly. Okay, so we have some different data sources here. Event IDs that we care about, and these all have to be enabled. They're not out of the box. 4768, Kerberos authentication request was requested. 4769, service ticket was requested. So what we see with golden tickets, because if you use a tool like Rubius or Mimikatz, you're forging that ticket entirely yourself. You're going to see a lot of service ticket requests, right? Access to a service without the corresponding 4768, because that ticket wasn't requested because you used Rubius to do it. And if you're familiar with BPMN diagram notation, it's a way of that businesses model their efficient flows. The famous example is, McDonald's made a BPMN diagram in the 1960s to say, how could we be more efficient? I just finished my master's a few weeks ago, and this played heavily in that. And I thought, okay, we can take this process, and you'll notice this doesn't look like the previous charts I showed you. Again, because there's so many different things at play, you can't really link specific behaviors to specific events. So this is just a way of documenting the attack flow for a golden ticket. And we're going to push through, again, a little just in the interest of time, but this will all be available on GitHub, and you can look at them to your heart's content then. Diamond ticket. So instead of creating your own TGT, what are you doing? You're modifying a legitimately issued TGT. So that way, you're not having that issue, right, of the 4768s not matching up with the 4769s, but it's a similar process. So we have some different event IDs that we care about here, and what we can do here is if you see that 476, lots of numbers to think about. If you think about that 4768, right, if you see a 4768 event and no services were requested, that's one tool you can use in your arsenal to surmise, okay, why would someone request a ticket and then not use it for any services? Something to look into. And here we have just the general attack flow for that diamond ticket, from initial access all the way to deciding whether or not the ticket is legitimate. Okay, so some data sources. We can use SACLs. You don't want to set SACLs on everything, right? You'll annoy your SOC and lead to alert fatigue, and nobody wants that. But you can be judicious by placing SACLs on objects that matter, like that NTDS that I mentioned, or making sure that Kerberos has telemetry enabled so you can incorporate that in your detection flow. You can also look at successful logon events, and again, just making sure you're tying that to some of the other telemetry we mentioned. All right, ADCS certificate theft. These CAs, they're not really treated same sensitivity as DCs. Mimikatz and a lot of tools that forge certificates have a cert validity of 1 year. So again, if you have an adversary with lazy tradecraft, you can just look through those Mimikatz defaults. And then we'll get into some of the underlying behavior in case you get some more enterprising adversaries. All right, so once the private cert is extracted, converted, forged certificate can be created and signed is ultimately at the end of this. I'm going to push through this technique just to get some to make sure we have some time for auditing. When we're talking about ADS certificate theft, some of my coworkers, Will Schroeder and Lee Christensen, you can go look at their white paper. Has anyone read Certified Pre-Owned yet or interacted with it? Best friend right there. It's a wonderful white paper to read. It goes through all of the escalations due to certificate theft and the detections associated with them. That'll be linked in the GitHub. And again, that's Certified Pre-Owned, Will Schroeder, Lee Christensen. Really, really useful and I think invaluable for SOCs and defenders trying to make sure they have detections for all the existing escalations that have been discovered. And we have here some of the events we care about, right? So I'll break this one down a little. For account used key storage provider on key file, we have user open key, security event 5058, the operation on key file was conducted with KSP, right? So again, each one of these events might not in themselves say anything important to us, but when they're all linked together, they tend to point towards adversary behavior, which is what we're trying to highlight, right? Defense in depth. Anyone that says they can just sell you an out-of-the-box detection solution that never needs to be updated is lying to you or trying to sell you something, right? You need to have a bunch of different layers in your detections so that the adversary just needs to make one mistake and then bam, you can respond accordingly. SCCM tight takeover. Who has familiar with this or Sharp SCCM, some of the tools out there? Yeah, so this one's super interesting. Usually with a lot of our red teams, I kid you not, it is like 15-minute your domain admin if you can carry out SCCM site takeover. It's something not a lot of people have patched or worked on. It's a super interesting tool. And basically what we're doing is, again, apologize for the rush, but from a coercive perspective, let's say there's client A, client B, and then you have your SCCM server, right? If I compromise client A, I know the IP address of the site server, right? So all I need to do is get domain admin on that server A. I can say, hey, give me your NTLM authentication. That site server then gives me the NTLM authentication to the compromised host, host A. What I can then do is intercept that authentication flow and coerce it to another server, let's say server B. And now I'm authenticating to that server that I did not have domain access on as SCCM, which has administrative privileges. So once the authentication is relayed, again, you can add yourself to those admin roles. There's a ton of really interesting research. One of my coworkers, Chris Thompson, maintains Sharp SCCM, which is an open source tool for SCCM site takeovers. Okay, so recovering from domain compromise, which is really what drove the interest in this talk, is there's the only worse thing than getting your domain compromised is to then walk in and having it compromised again, right? Because you weren't able to successfully root out the adversary. So again, most organizations have recovery strategies as a requirement directed by compliance. I'm unsure of the regulations here, but in the United States, a lot of those regulations are just people checking the box. And if you actually look at the content, it's a lot of fluff, right? For a lot of the playbooks or runbooks that they have. They often lack quality. They often lack valid testing. Sometimes domain recovery strategies cherry pick specific items to rotate instead of considering the entire attack path and how that plays into how your domain was compromised. So we're going to look at some things here. How you determine the scope, how you replace or reprovision your domain controllers without needing to take down your domain entirely, how to rotate accounts and object secrets, how to rotate your certificates, and how to enable additional auditing, right? Making sure that you have the telemetry you need to ensure that the adversary has been pushed out, and you can hopefully catch them next time. So when we did this research, my manager initially said to me, hey, it would be really cool if you could give remediation guidance for each of the techniques you talked about at the beginning. And in theory, right, that sounds like a great idea. Okay, I saw DCSync. How do I recover from that? Okay, cool. I found a golden ticket. How do I recover from that? But the reality is, if I see any of those steps in my environment, again, what is it a symbol of? A larger attack path. I would want to go through these steps anyway, because how do I know, if someone got a golden ticket, how do I know they didn't use Sharp SCCM? How do I know they didn't use certificate authentication abuse, right? So we want to make sure that we go through those triage and remediation steps if it's a valid adversary behavior. If it's a red team, that's different. Okay, so the goal here, right, is we want to identify accurately what's in scope so that containment can properly reduce the exfil attack surface. So when we think about highly privileged accounts that are both on-prem and in Azure, that would end up putting Azure in scope. which is a whole other talk, right? So Microsoft recommends keeping Azure highly privileged accounts in the cloud only, so you don't have this kind of mesh that you then have to worry about. A lot of the times, someone pays for a red team, right? And if that red team gets caught, the company says, okay, well, I already paid for this bucket of time. Hey, blue team, ignore them. Like, let them operate as normal. Because we paid for it, and it's expensive, and we want to, see what else we can get out of it. We personally, at least, encourage clients to try to kick us out and remediate as we go. We use completely automated infrastructure, different IOCs, hashes again. So reasonably confident we can find another attack surface. But that's one of the issues we have, right? A lot of times companies aren't able to actually go through the remediation playbooks. Because again, due to cost constraints or business considerations, you want that red team to quote unquote do more work in your domain. So when user and service accounts, trust passwords, and certificates, they can all be rotated. The domain DP API key, which I mentioned earlier from that NTDS.dit file, is the one thing that cannot be rotated as per Microsoft documentation. Now, that's what Microsoft says. I have a coworker that found that you can indeed rotate that domain DP API backup key. What does it do? It's responsible for encrypting and decrypting everything within the domain. So I want everyone to think for a second. If I change what is encrypting and decrypting everything within my domain, and that fails, what did I just do to myself? I just ransomware to myself, right? For free. And there's no way to get that back. So that is why Microsoft recommends do not touch the DP API backup key, because I would imagine there would be some legal complications if anything bad were to happen. But one of my coworkers is actually on a research sabbatical right now looking into methods of doing so. So it's possible, but again, it's just up to you and your leadership. Do you trust X third-party tool to not ransomware my entire company? So that's one of the issues we have, right? And again, that's why NTDS.dit is such a big issue. Anything less than creating an entirely new domain from scratch, that's the only way to create an entirely new DP API backup key, again, per that Microsoft documentation. And if you can't afford to start from scratch, and almost no enterprise can, here are a few things you can do instead. And you see all these steps here. Again, the purpose of this is you can go to GitHub and go in your sandbox or your lab and go through these steps yourself to test it out. I won't necessarily be reading them line item by line item, which hopefully is a good thing. Each of these methods is going to have different curveballs that make that process more difficult. And again, keep in mind that DP API backup key is really critical when we're talking about this overall. And we also care about the flexible single master operations, the FSMO roles, also known as the operations master roles. And what we're doing here, right, when we're replacing or reprovisioning our domain controllers, we're creating an existing server that's not a DC, right? So hopefully it hasn't been targeted or compromised. We can verify that. We're applying our patches to that server. We're adding ADDS to that new server. We're promoting it to DC. And then we're validating and moving all those roles from the old DC to the new one, which hopefully has not been compromised. And again, here's some steps you can do. And it's very critical that you verify the health of your new domain controller as you go through these steps. And it's very critical throughout any of these processes that you wait for replication to occur. Again, if you move through a step too quickly and something hasn't replicated across your whole domain, you just ransomwared your domain. So you want to make sure that you're running through these health checks. You want to make sure that that's not going to occur. All right. So again, with user accounts, we want to rotate these. Usually they involve one or two compromised domain admin accounts, and those are central to the larger attack path. So literally within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, this should be your first SLA. You've identified the domain persistence on a controller. You need to find the compromised tier 0 assets and immediately disable their permissions. You could have, in a more dire situation, you have to disable all of them, which hopefully is not the case, but that's something to keep into consideration. That's what you want to do first, right? Take away their immediate access to that DC so they can't pivot or laterally move. All right. So service accounts, those can be temperamental or legacy when we talk about rotating service accounts. I did an internship for a municipality in the United States before I found my job at SpectreOps, did network security there. It was for utility and wastewater treatment, and I was trying to build up their security program for their Modbus TCP on like all the controllers and pumps and things like that, and linking that to enterprise detection in their SOC. And I said, okay, first things first, where do we log all the TCP Modbus traffic? Logs? Oh, okay. and that is why I did not stay there. But when we're thinking about service accounts rights, a lot of that legacy equipment, and especially if we're talking about companies with large industrial components, those service accounts can be 20, 30 years old, and the password could be password 123. But if you change it, then you're locked out of a certain part of your enterprise. And I see some people nodding, so I know it's a painful point. So before you rotate those service accounts, work with your service engineering or security engineering department. They know what needs to exist and where, and what could be broken if you potentially do some replication or account rotations. All right, so this is, again, just talking about that collaboration, and really this is what this should be. You don't want your red team, your blue team, your purple team, whatever the case is, working in isolation. You want everyone to be sharing information, to be collaborating, which, again, is why those runbooks are so critical. If you as an enterprise don't have domain recovery runbooks, it's something you might want to look into, right? And you want to look into, okay, I need the CISO to talk to this person. I need the head of the SOC to talk to this. I need our data engineers to make sure to find and locate the accounts that we need to operate our business. And this should all be built into those runbooks that we're worried about. Luckily enough, when we're talking about rotating service accounts like the KRBTGT, Microsoft has a lot of valuable commandlets and PowerShell scripts on their website, official Microsoft PowerShell scripts. You can go through, there'll be, again, links in our GitHub. And this one uses new tac KRBTGT keys.ps1, which is the PowerShell script that Microsoft provided in order to rotate those KRBTGT accounts. And again, wait until replication is complete. Don't do this in like 10 minutes and then come blame me when you've ransomwared yourself. You want to make sure that replication has spread and that everything has occurred quickly. If it takes 24 to 48 hours to rotate some of these, that's what it is. But again, you're going through these steps to hopefully keep your enterprise up. And it does you no good if nobody can access the enterprise. So that script that I mentioned is going to change the KRBTGT account password and validate that that replication was successful. All right. So, machine accounts, again, it's not going to remediate coercion and relay. There's a hotfix, which I have here on the bottom right, that you can look at a later date, and that'll help you deal with NTM relay issues. Okay, I have 2 minutes. We're going to briefly touch on this. So enforce with multiple domains. Microsoft, in its documentation, uses a shared secure password and converts it into cryptographic key. And what that key means is an inter-realm trust key, right? So again, if the one domain was compromised and that inter-realm trust key was compromised, that means the domain it was linked to is also compromised. So that's something else that in our research we found you need to research and deal with. Okay, with CAs, you want to initiate a revocation process, you want to update the revocation labels, and you want to republish your certificate revocation list as you go through this process. Okay, so for additional auditing, every time a domain recovers from domain compromise, leadership asks, how can we stop this from happening again? Reality is you can't, right? There are too many attack surfaces, too many humans, with humans being the weakest chain. So what we can do is turn on additional auditing, go through those SACLs, making sure we're getting event IDs associated with specific attacks, to try to reduce adversary dwell time, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. They only have to mess up once, hopefully, for your detection team to be able to operate and act appropriately. All right. How do we know which new logs to ingest? In tools like Bloodhound, you can have an alert or logic to say, hey, this account is Kerberoastable. Or you can have, hey, someone downgraded to RC4 encryption, right? Some different tools you can use. Go back to those events I mentioned in those entity relationship diagrams and break those down to try to see, okay, what is the atomic behavior targeted by the tool or technique that I'm worried about? So in conclusion, a lot of organizations don't have custom detections for this, right? They don't have run books for domain persistent behavior. They're important because they're part of that larger attack path. They are never in isolation. And when we're talking about recovery, we're trying to reduce that adversary dwell time and have playbooks to help you recover from those scenarios successfully. Here are my coworkers that helped me with some of the Sharp SCCM. Alex Sue is the one that is working on the DP API backup key rotation, and a lot of my other coworkers who were very kind with their time in helping me kind of work through all these processes. And that's it. I think exactly on time, right? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have any time for questions? Okay, perfect. So we do have time for a few questions, if anyone has any. I can go back to stuff I already showed as well, because I know we kind of rushed through some things.
Have you actually seen the clients beginning to
Sadly, on the client perspective, not really, because it's not, for whatever reason, something that blue teams or SOCs, because SOCs are already overburdened as it is, and they're out of the 20 clients I've worked with since I've joined SpectreOps, only one is what I would call mature from a detection standpoint, and they're a Fortune 20 company. So, like, it just takes a lot of resources to do that. But Jonas and Andy Robbins, the two architects of Bloodhound, publish new escalations all the time. So SpectreOps, we have a Medium page with all of their research. So new escalations are there as they're put out. And sadly, there are only 5 of us on the detection side of SpectreOps, but we try to go through and match it with detections as they come out with the escalations. Yep. Yes. I'm very sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah, so the question was, if you have that inter-realm trust key is compromised, like, do you have to rotate everything in both domains twice? If you find that evidence of adversary behavior, then yes. And again, this is just, I'm trying to talk from like a realistic perspective. The good theory answer would be, rotate it all. If you don't find adversary behavior on there, you can kind of keep a lid on that while you try to deal with the initial domain. That domain trust key, though, would need to be rotated itself. How much more time do we have? Oh, perfect. Any other questions? Now, anyone have any slides you want me to go back to? I know we pushed through some of the diagrams and stuff pretty quickly. All right. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm going to put the GitHub has all these slides as well as some of the test scripts and links to all the research we have and the links to all that Microsoft, the official commandlets and scripts that we talked about. So I will pass that on so that can get sent to all of you. And again, you can kind of go through those steps on those slides in your sandbox and your lab environment and test it out for yourself. And I'll be around, so feel free to come up. It's a big topic that I think is kind of underserved by the detection community, so I'd love to hear any and all feedback. Thank you again.